The rise of Nazism in Germany is the story of a nation in turmoil, where economic collapse, vengeful nationalism, class warfare, and a fear of communism paved the way for a brutal dictatorship. How did a fringe party like the Nazis take power in one of Europe's most advanced societies? To understand, we must dive deep into the social, political, and economic chaos of post-World War I Germany. This is a story of social conflict, propaganda, and a counter-revolutionary frenzy that transformed a nation. Germany, after its defeat in the First World War, was a broken country. A once proud empire, facing defeat, had fallen to the revolution that brought the Weimar Republic into being. Treaty of Versailles, signed with the victorious Allies in 1919, placed full responsibility for the war on Germany, imposing crushing reparations that devastated the economy. The cost of the reparations was immense. The government, under the Weimar Republic, struggled to maintain stability. Unemployment soared, and the hyperinflation of 1923 wiped out the savings of the middle class. The currency fell rapidly against the dollar. Prices doubled in hours, tripled overnight. A lifetime of saving could vanish in a day. Germany already had a history of working-class politics, with a powerful Social Democratic Party, the SPD, rooted in strong trade unions and committed to reforming capitalism within a parliamentary political structure. But the SPD had failed to stop the march into the First World War. It had instead sided with the national government, like other social democratic parties in Europe. The communist movement split away from the Social Democrats across Europe during the years of the war, galvanized by the success of the revolutionary Bolsheviks in taking power in Russia in 1917. With the war over, in Germany, the SPD took power in the 1919 elections, under the leadership of Friedrich Ebert, but they faced a challenge from their left. The working class, impoverished and radicalized, was increasingly divided, with many turning to communism and revolutionary politics instead of the Social Democrats' politics. Meanwhile, the middle and upper classes, terrified of communist revolution, sought protection from what they saw as a rising red tide. They would eventually turn to the far right as a counterbalance to the communist threat. Class warfare dominated the streets of Germany in the 1920s. The communists, under the leadership of the German Communist Party, the KPD, fought for a socialist revolution, inspired by the Bolsheviks in Russia. Workers' strikes, uprisings, and violent street battles became common. The ruling elites and business interests saw communism as an existential threat. Liberal Democrats, who favored parliamentary government, also feared that a communist revolution would destroy the fragile democracy. The fear was very real. Germany had already seen communist uprisings in the months following the end of the war. The Spartacist revolt of 1919 highlighted the divide between reformist and revolutionary sections of the German left. This uprising was a power struggle between the supporters of the provisional government led by Ebert and the SPD, and those who supported the KPD, led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. While the SPD wanted a social democratic parliamentary system, the communists had called for a republic based on workers' councils like the Soviets in Russia. Uprising was crushed by the Social Democrats using brutal militias known as the Freikorps. Recruited from ex-soldiers with the hatred of the left, the paramilitary Freikorps dealt out violence against communists with a relish. The SPD's use of right-wing violence to crush the communists was to leave a legacy of bitterness. An economic recovery began, but it was not to last. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash on the US stock exchange caused a global economic depression. In Europe, Germany was worst affected because American banks called in all of their foreign loans at very short notice. These loans had been the basis for Weimar Germany's economic recovery from the disaster of hyperinflation. The loans had funded German industry and helped pay reparations. Without these loans, German industry collapsed and a depression began. Over the winter of 1929 to 1930, the number of unemployed rose from 1.4 million to over 2. By 1933, With unemployment at 6 million, 1 in every 3 Germans was out of work. It was in this context that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party found fertile ground for their message. They cleverly positioned themselves as defenders of the nation, promising to protect Germany from both the perceived threat of communist revolution and the weakness of the Weimar Republic. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, were masters of propaganda. They painted communism as a Jewish plot to undermine German society, feeding into deep-seated anti-Semitic beliefs. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, used every medium available, radio, newspapers, film, and mass rallies, to push this narrative. Before the Great Depression, the Nazis had struggled to maintain relevance, unable to win elections. Trying to copy the example of the Italian fascists, who had taken power by bullying Italian elites through their march on Rome, the Nazis tried their own version. They moved to seize power in the Munich Beer Hall Putsch of 1923. This, however, became a failed coup attempt by armed supporters of the Nazi Party. Local judges were fanatically pro-Nazi and tried to let off the leaders of the party without any consequences. In the end, Hitler served just 8 months in prison. Though Hitler failed to achieve his immediate goal, the Putsch attempt did give the Nazis national attention and a propaganda victory. He began to fine-tune his messaging for the people. In his famous 1925 book, Mein Kampf, he writes, "The art of propaganda consists precisely in being able to awaken the imagination of the public through an appeal to their feelings. The broad masses of the people are not made up of diplomats or professors of public jurisprudence, nor simply of persons who are able to form reasoned judgment in given cases, but a vacillating crowd of human children who are constantly wavering between one idea and another." Nazi propaganda played upon the fears of the middle class. They were depicted as the victims of a potential communist uprising that would bring chaos and destruction. The Nazis promised to preserve order, protect property, and crucially, restore national pride. The German middle class, desperate for security, increasingly saw Hitler as a savior. The Great Depression and inflation following 1929 came as a great opportunity for the Nazi Party. It began to grow rapidly from a fringe force to a mainstream party. But the Nazis didn't rise to power on their own. Germany's business elite, industrialists, bankers, and landowners played a crucial role. Fearing that a communist revolution would nationalize the industries and strip them of their wealth, they began to finance Hitler's rise. Prominent industrialist Fritz Thyssen was among those who bankrolled the Nazis. He was among those who later regretted their support, imprisoned, as Hitler led the country into war with the world. He had hoped that the Nazis could rob the leftists of working class support while also crushing the parties of the left. The business class and conservative politicians made a Faustian bargain. They believed they could use Hitler and the Nazis to crush the communists and restore Germany's economy, then discard them when they were no longer needed. But as history would show, Hitler was not a puppet to be controlled. By 1932, Germany was in political paralysis. The Nazis were the largest party in the Reichstag, but they didn't have enough power to govern outright. The communists were also gaining seats, heightening fears of a socialist revolution. Street violence between Nazi stormtroopers, the SA, and communist paramilitary groups made the political crisis feel like a civil war. In July 1932, with the Reichstag elections, the Nazis became the largest single party with 230 seats, but still did not have a majority. Hitler demanded to be made chancellor, but the conservative political elites still hesitated. Conservative politicians Franz von Papen and Kurt von Schleicher were struggling for the chancellorship between themselves, even as the Nazis demanded power. Chancellor Franz von Papen called elections in November 1932 to win a majority in parliament. The Nazis lost 34 seats but remained the largest party. Von Papen resigned. President Hindenburg appointed Kurt von Schleicher as chancellor. Now, the new chancellor, Kurt von Schleicher, tried to split the Nazis by asking leading Nazi Gregor Strasser to be his vice-chancellor. Hitler forced Strasser to decline. As von Schleicher now struggled to maintain his government, on the 9th of January 1933, Papen and Hindenburg agreed to form a new government that would bring in Hitler. On the 23rd of January, Papen presented to President Hindenburg his idea for Hitler to be made chancellor, while keeping him boxed in. Schleicher asked the president to declare a state of emergency instead. But Hindenburg had decided to allow Hitler in. So on the 30th of January 1933, the president appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Little did von Papen or Hindenburg know, they just handed the keys of Germany to a man who would dismantle its democracy within weeks. Now it was the new Nazi government's goal to destroy its enemies on the left, the Social Democrats and the Communists alike. The Reichstag Fire on the 27th of February 1933 was the great turning point, allowing the Nazis an excuse to repress their enemies. Even though the fire had been started by a lone Dutch activist, the Nazis blamed the Communist Party in Germany, claiming that they were attempting a revolution. Hitler used the fire as a pretext to push through the Reichstag Fire decree, which suspended civil liberties and allowed for the arrest of political opponents, primarily communists. Among the German communists arrested on the basis of the Reichstag Fire decree was KPD chairman Ernst Thälmann. His life would end in a Nazi concentration camp during the Second World War. General elections were scheduled for the 5th of March 1933. The Reichstag Fire decree allowed the Nazis to suspend freedom of press and habeas corpus rights just 5 days before the election. The Nazis failed to gain an absolute majority in parliament and depended on their coalition partner, the German National People's Party, to reach 52% in total. To free himself from depending on such allies, Hitler had the cabinet draw up plans for an enabling act, which would give the cabinet legislative power for 4 years. The Nazis devised the enabling act to gain complete political power without the need of a support of a majority in the Reichstag and without the need to bargain with their coalition partners. The elections of March 1933 were to be Germany's last. The Nazis moved swiftly, rounding up tens of thousands of communists, socialists, and trade unionists. With the communists out of the way, Hitler faced little resistance. On the 23rd of March 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler the power to rule by decree. Germany's brief experiment with democracy was over. What followed was the rapid Nazification of Germany. Political opponents were jailed or killed, unions were dismantled, and Jewish citizens became scapegoats for all of Germany's woes. The Nazi regime solidified its grip on power through terror, propaganda, and the machinery of a police state. One of the most significant changes introduced by the Nazis was the overhaul of the education system. Schools became tools for indoctrination, with curricula designed to teach children loyalty to Hitler, Nazi ideology, and racial purity. Subjects like history and biology were twisted to promote anti-Semitism and the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. The Nazis viewed youth organizations as critical in shaping the next generation. The Hitler Youth for Boys and the League of German Girls were compulsory by 1936. These groups focused on physical fitness, military training, and instilling obedience to the Führer. The Hitler Youth prepared boys for future military service, while the League of German Girls reinforced traditional gender roles, training girls for motherhood and domestic duties. Contraception and abortion were restricted for Aryan women, while those considered unfit, including Jews, Roma, and those with disabilities, were often subjected to forced sterilization. These eugenics policies reflected the Nazis' obsession with racial purity and their desire to build a master race. A central pillar of Nazi social policy was its obsession with racial purity. Jews, Roma, mentally ill people, and various other groups were considered inferior. The infamous Nuremberg laws of 1935 institutionalized racism by prohibiting marriage or sexual relations between Jews and Aryans, stripping Jews of their German citizenship, and excluding them from various professions. The Nazis used large-scale public spectacles, like rallies and parades, to create a sense of unity and collective purpose. Hitler's speeches were broadcast across the nation, and the Nazi regime was adept at manipulating emotions, evoking national pride, and creating an image of a rejuvenated Germany under Nazi leadership. Hitler had boasted of a 1,000-year Reich, but it would last 12 years. The Nazi Party went on to lead Germany into World War and eventually defeat, resulting in total occupation by the Allies in 1945. Germany's descent into Nazi rule was not inevitable. It was the result of calculated moves by elites, the manipulation of popular fears, and a brilliant propaganda campaign that turned a fringe movement into a brutal regime.